Happy birthday, Dad. Now take your old suitcase and get the hell off my property before I call the county sheriff to drag your useless body to the curb, my son barked. I stood shivering on the driveway of the $6 million estate I built with 30 years of sweat, holding only $42 in my wallet and a single bag of worn-out clothes. My son didn't realize that while he was changing the locks on my front door, a hidden legacy left by my late wife was already waiting for me in the dark. My name is Arthur Miller. I'm 64 years old, and I spent my entire life in Chicago building Miller Construction from a single rusty pickup truck into a multi-million-dollar local empire. I've lived in the same suburban neighborhood for decades, working 14-hour days in the freezing Illinois winters to ensure my only son, Leo, never had to lift a heavy hammer or break a sweat. My greatest mistake was believing that providing a life of absolute luxury would naturally instill a sense of gratitude and loyalty in a boy who never understood the true value of a dollar. After my wife Martha passed away 5 years ago, the light seemed to leave our home, and I poured all my remaining energy into making sure Leo was set for life without worries. I gave him the vice presidency, a company credit card with no limit, and a brand new Italian sports car that cost more than my first 3 years of profit in the construction business. Leo took it all with a smirk, never saying thank you or asking how my back felt after a long day at the job site overseeing the new downtown high-rise development projects. He started dating a woman named Vanessa who wore designer clothes and looked at my calloused hands as if they were covered in some kind of contagious disease whenever we shared a meal. Vanessa whispered in his ear about modernizing the company, which really meant selling off our local equipment and firing the men who had been loyal to me since the very first day. I tried to explain that those men were the backbone of our success, but Leo just rolled his eyes and told me that my old-school methods were holding him back from real wealth. Then the pneumonia hit me last November, leaving me gasping for air in a sterile hospital bed while Leo hovered over me with a stack of legal documents he claimed were insurance. I was too weak to read the fine print, trusting my own flesh and blood as I signed my name with a shaking hand, thinking I was just protecting our family's future assets. As soon as I was discharged, I noticed the atmosphere in the office had changed, and the locks on the main safe had been replaced without anyone bothering to give me the code. Leo stopped taking my calls, and when I finally caught him in the hallway, he told me to go home and rest because I was clearly losing my edge and slowing down. I spent the next few months isolated in my own house, watching through the security cameras as Leo and Vanessa hosted lavish parties with people I didn't know and certainly didn't trust. They spoke about me as if I were already a ghost, mocking my sensible shoes and the way I saved the Sunday newspapers to check the local construction bids and equipment auctions. On the morning of my 64th birthday, I woke up early, expecting at least a card or a simple breakfast, but instead, I found 2 large moving men standing in my bedroom. They told me they had orders to clear the room by noon, and when I ran downstairs to find Leo, he was sitting at the mahogany dining table eating a quiet breakfast. The house is in my name now, Arthur, and Vanessa wants to turn your wing into a yoga studio, so it's time for you to find a place that fits your budget. I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth, the very mouth I had fed with the best food money could buy for over 35 years without ever asking for anything. I built this house for your mother and me, Leo, and you wouldn't even have a roof over your head if I hadn't worked until my knuckles bled in the Chicago frost. He just laughed, a cold and hollow sound that echoed through the marble foyer, and tossed a heavy ring of rusted keys onto the table next to his expensive organic green juice. You still own that dumpy industrial garage on the south side, the one Mom used for her hobby projects, so go live there with the rest of the outdated junk and scrap. Vanessa walked in then, smirking as she adjusted her diamond earrings, and told me that my presence was ruining the aesthetic of their new life and making the neighbors feel quite uncomfortable. The moving men didn't even let me pack my own things, throwing a few pairs of jeans and my old work boots into a battered suitcase before escorting me out the door. I stood on the sidewalk as the heavy iron gates clicked shut, realizing that the son I had loved more than my own life had just rendered me homeless on my birthday. I walked 3 miles to the nearest bus stop, my chest still heavy from the lingering effects of the illness, clutching those rusted keys like they were the only lifeline I had. The city felt colder than usual as I rode the bus toward the industrial district, passing by the skyscrapers I had helped build when I was young and full of foolish hope. The garage was located in a desolate area surrounded by scrap yards and shuttered warehouses, a place where the streetlights flickered and the smell of old oil hung thick in the air. I arrived at the gated lot just as the sun was setting, the chain-link fence sagging under the weight of years of neglect and the rusted padlock resisting my every desperate turn. When the gate finally groaned open, I saw the small cinder block building where Martha used to spend her weekends, claiming she was just organizing my old files and painting landscape pictures. I hadn't stepped foot in this place since her funeral, mainly because the memories of her smile were too painful to face while I was struggling to keep the company afloat. The interior was freezing and smelled of dust, but I found an old cot in the corner and a small space heater that surprisingly hummed to life when I plugged it in. I sat there in the dark, eating a cold sandwich I bought at a gas station, wondering how a man who had earned millions could end up sleeping on a metal frame. My mind kept going back to Martha, remembering how she used to tell me that I was too soft on Leo and that the boy needed to understand the weight of responsibility. She had been a quiet woman, a former bookkeeper who handled our personal finances with a secretiveness that I always assumed was just her way of keeping the household running smoothly. "Arthur, you build the walls, and I'll make sure the foundation never cracks," she used to say, her eyes twinkling with a hidden knowledge that I was too busy to investigate. I looked around the dusty room, seeing her old desk covered in a thick layer of grime and several boxes of what appeared to be old construction invoices and tax records. I felt a sudden surge of anger, not just at Leo, but at myself for being so blind to the greed that had been growing in my own home like a poisonous weed. Tomorrow, I would have to go to the Social Security office and see if I could scrape together enough for a decent apartment, but for tonight, the garage was my only shelter. I tried to sleep, but the sound of the wind whistling through the gaps in the window frame kept me awake, along with the deep ache in my tired, aging bones. Around 3 in the morning, I stood up to pace the small floor, my boots scuffing against the oil-stained concrete that Martha had insisted on sealing herself a few years ago. I noticed a specific section of the floor under the heavy workbench looked different, the concrete smoother and slightly higher than the rest of the aging industrial foundation in the room. I remembered Martha spending weeks down here with a jackhammer and a bag of premix, telling me she was just fixing a dangerous settlement crack that was bothering her ankles. Curiosity finally overcame my exhaustion, and I dragged the heavy oak workbench aside, revealing a perfectly rectangular seam in the floor that didn't match the surrounding slab at all. There was a small metal ring recessed into the concrete, hidden under a layer of old shop rags and a discarded pile of rusted plumbing fixtures and broken ceramic tiles. I pulled the ring with all my strength, my muscles screaming as the heavy concrete-topped plug groaned and finally lifted, revealing a deep, steel-lined compartment built into the very earth. Inside the hole sat 3 heavy waterproof Pelican cases, the kind used by the military to protect sensitive equipment from moisture, heat, and the passage of many long years. On top of the first case was a laminated letter in Martha's neat, professional handwriting, addressed to me with a date from exactly 1 week before she was taken by cancer. "My dearest Arthur, if you are reading this, it means our son has done exactly what I feared he would do once I was no longer there to keep him in check." The letter explained that she had been diverting a small percentage of our profits for 20 years, knowing that Leo's entitlement would eventually lead to my financial and emotional ruin. "I didn't do this to deceive you, but to protect the legacy you worked so hard to build, because I knew you would never be able to say no to him." I opened the first case with trembling fingers and found rows upon rows of gold Krugerrands, their dull yellow luster shining back at me in the dim light of the heater. The second case was filled with vacuum-sealed stacks of $100 bills, organized by year and meticulously counted, representing a fortune that didn't exist on any corporate ledger or bank. I sat on the cold floor and wept, realizing that my wife had loved me enough to build a fortress of gold beneath my feet, while I was busy building mansions for others. The third case contained a set of deeds to 3 apartment complexes in the city, all held in a private trust that Leo had no knowledge of and no legal claim to. There was also a flash drive and a folder full of metadata and recorded phone calls Martha had collected during her final months, proving Leo had been embezzling company funds. She had documented every secret meeting Leo had with Vanessa, every forged signature on the company checks, and every conversation they had about getting rid of the old man. I realized then that I wasn't a broken failure living in a junk garage. I was a man with the resources to take back everything that had been stolen from me. I spent the rest of the night reading through the legal documents, seeing the genius of Martha's plan to ensure that my retirement was never at the mercy of our son. The total value of the gold and cash alone was over $3.5 million, not including the rental income from the apartment buildings that had been accumulating. The trust was managed by an old law firm downtown, run by a man I had known for 40 years who had kept this secret as a final professional favor to Martha. As the sun began to rise over the industrial park, the gray light filtering through the dirty windows, I felt a strength in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. I washed my face in the small utility sink, the cold water snapping me into a state of absolute clarity as I planned my first move against the boy who betrayed me. I put on my best remaining shirt, dusted off my work boots, and tucked the folder of evidence under my arm, ready to visit the only lawyer Leo couldn't buy. I walked out of that garage and locked the gate, no longer seeing a scrapyard but a headquarters for the most important construction project of my entire professional life. Leo thought he had left me with trash, but he had actually handed me the keys to his own destruction and my ultimate restoration to the head of the Miller family. I called a private car service from my old flip phone, using the last of my $42 to get a ride to the prestigious offices of Henderson and Associates. When the receptionist saw my rumpled clothes, she started to ask if I had an appointment, but I simply stated my name and watched her expression change to one of shock. "Mr. Miller, we have been waiting for your call for 5 years, and Mr. Henderson has left strict instructions to clear his entire schedule the moment you arrived at our door." I was led into a mahogany-lined office where my old friend stood up, his eyes softening with a mix of pity and professional resolve as he shook my weathered hand. "Arthur, I am so sorry for what happened yesterday, but Martha made sure you would have the sharpest teeth in the room when the time finally came to fight back. We spent 4 hours going through the evidence Martha had buried, which included proof that Leo had intentionally falsified my medical records to gain power of attorney over my estate. The betrayal was deeper than I imagined, as Leo had even tried to sell the company to a rival firm for a quick payout, ignoring the jobs of 200 employees. "We can file for an emergency injunction by noon, Arthur, and I suggest we start by freezing every single account associated with Miller Construction and the family trust immediately." I nodded, feeling a cold satisfaction knowing that Leo's gold-plated world was about to come crashing down before he could even finish his lunch with Vanessa at the country club. I pushed the heavy steel door open, the hinges screaming in protest as I stepped into the dark, dusty space that my son called trash, unaware of what was beneath the concrete. "Mr. Henderson clicked his mouse with a definitive snap, and within seconds, electronic signals were sent to every major bank in the city to freeze the Miller Construction corporate operating and payroll accounts. I sat back in the expensive leather chair, feeling a strange mixture of heavy sorrow and cold, calculating justice as I imagined Leo's face when his platinum card was inevitably declined. He's going to come looking for you the moment he realizes the money is gone, Arthur. So I've already arranged for a private security detail to meet you at the industrial garage. I thanked him but insisted on handling this my own way, as I needed to see the look in my son's eyes when he finally realized that his father wasn't actually broken. I returned to the garage, which now felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary of truth, and spent the afternoon carefully moving the gold into a more portable arrangement. Around 3 in the afternoon, the sound of a high-performance engine roared through the quiet industrial street, and I knew before I even looked that Leo had arrived in his sports car. He practically kicked the rusted metal gate open, his face a bright shade of crimson as he stormed toward me, waving his useless piece of plastic in the dusty, oil-scented air. "What did you do to the company accounts, you old fossil? And why is the bank telling me that I no longer have the authority to sign any business checks or withdrawals?" I didn't look up from the old wooden desk where I was quietly drinking a cup of thermos coffee, letting the silence stretch until the sweat began to bead on his forehead. "I didn't do anything that wasn't already set in motion by your mother years ago, Leo, because she saw the greedy, entitled man you were becoming long before I ever suspected it." He let out a hysterical laugh, claiming that Martha was just a simple housewife who didn't understand the complexities of modern construction or the high-stakes world of international real estate development projects. "She understood enough to know that you would try to steal my life's work, So she built a separate foundation that you can never touch, no matter how many lawyers you hire. Vanessa stepped out of the car then, looking disgusted by the grime on her designer heels, and demanded that I stop this ridiculous game and hand over the new access codes immediately. I stood up slowly, my back straight and my voice steady, and told her that her days of living off my sweat and blood were officially over as of 9 o'clock this morning. You both have exactly 24 hours to vacate the mansion because the deed was actually held by a trust that requires my signature to remain valid, and I am revoking my consent. Leo's bravado vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer terror as he realized that the legal documents he had forced me to sign in the hospital were actually completely and utterly worthless. He tried to change his tone, calling me dad and claiming the eviction was just a big misunderstanding caused by the stress of running the company during my long and difficult recovery. I looked him in the eye and told him that a son doesn't throw his father into the street on his birthday over a misunderstanding, especially not a father who gave him everything. They left the garage in a cloud of dust and expensive exhaust fumes, but I knew they were heading straight to the mansion to try and hide whatever assets they had left. I called the apartment manager of the Martha Heights complex, one of the 3 buildings my wife had secretly purchased, and told him to prepare the penthouse suite for my immediate arrival. It was surreal to walk into a building I had owned for 5 years without knowing it, greeted by staff who treated me with more respect than my own son ever had. The penthouse was modest but elegant, filled with the kind of comfortable furniture Martha loved, and on the wall was a framed photo of us during our very first year of marriage. I spent the evening reviewing the embezzlement files Martha had collected, which showed that Leo had been funneling millions into a shell company registered in Vanessa's younger brother's name for several years. The evidence was so overwhelming that I knew the district attorney would have no choice but to file criminal charges once Henderson delivered the boxes of physical and digital records tomorrow morning. My heart felt like lead as I realized my son might actually go to prison, but then I remembered the cold wind on the driveway and the way he called me useless. The next morning, I arrived at the Miller Construction headquarters in a taxi, walking past the security guards who had been told just yesterday that I was no longer allowed in the building. I didn't say a word. I just handed them the court order signed by a judge at 8 a.m., which reinstated me as the sole chief executive officer with absolute and total authority. I walked into the boardroom where Leo was trying to convince the department heads to stay loyal to him, promising them bonuses that I knew he could never actually afford to pay. The room went silent as I walked to the head of the table, and for the first time in months, I felt like the man who had built this company from nothing. Leo, please pack your personal belongings and leave the premises, because the sheriff is already downstairs waiting to escort you and Vanessa out of this building and off my payroll forever. He tried to make a scene, screaming about how he had modernized the business, but the veteran foremen in the room just turned their backs on him and looked toward me with relief. I spent the rest of the day meeting with my old crew, apologizing for the chaos and promising them that their jobs were safe and their pensions would be fully restored immediately. Word spread quickly through the construction community that Arthur Miller was back in the saddle, and by sunset, 3 major developers had already called to discuss bringing their projects back to us. That evening, I drove my old truck back to the mansion, not to move back in, but to watch as the locks were changed once again, this time by my own trusted locksmiths. Leo and Vanessa were standing on the lawn, surrounded by designer luggage and several boxes of expensive shoes, looking completely lost in the world they thought they had conquered so easily. You can stay in that industrial garage I gave you, Leo. It's the only property I haven't reclaimed yet, and maybe a few nights on that old cot will teach you some humility. Vanessa began to scream that she would sue me for emotional distress, but I just handed her a copy of the embezzlement report and watched the color drain from her manicured face. I didn't feel the joy I thought I would, only a profound sense of exhaustion as I realized that the family I had worked for was now just a collection of legal battles. I decided to put the mansion on the market the very next day because it was filled with too many ghosts of the man I had raised and the wife I missed. I spent the next month living in the apartment complex, getting to know the tenants and fixing small things myself just to keep my hands busy and my mind off the pain. Leo's lawyers tried to fight the trust, but Martha had built it with the precision of a master architect, and every loophole they tried to exploit was already sealed tight against them. The police eventually caught up with them at a cheap motel near the airport, as they were trying to flee the state before the grand jury could finish reviewing the embezzlement evidence. Seeing my son's mugshot on the evening news was the hardest moment of my life, but I knew that letting him continue his path of destruction would have been a greater failure. I went back to the garage one last time to pack up Martha's things, and I found a small box I had missed, containing a pair of my very first work gloves. There was another note tucked inside the thumb of the glove, saying that she always knew I was a builder who could fix anything, even a broken heart or a shattered family. I began to focus on charity work, using a portion of the gold Martha had saved to fund trade schools for kids who wanted to learn how to build things with their hands. My old foreman, Bill, joined me as a consultant, and together we started a program to help struggling veterans find steady work and housing within our new development projects across the city. Life became quieter and more meaningful, and I realized that while I had lost a son to greed, I had gained a purpose that was much larger than my own personal wealth. Every Sunday, I would visit Martha's grave and tell her about the people we were helping, and I could almost hear her voice telling me that I was doing a good job. Leo sent me a letter from the county jail, blaming me for his choices and demanding that I pay for a better legal team to get him out of the mess he made. I didn't reply, not because I didn't love him, but because he needed to finally face the consequences of his actions without his father standing there to catch him when he fell down. Vanessa reached out too, offering to testify against Leo in exchange for a clean slate, but I simply forwarded her email to the district attorney and blocked her number from my phone. The industrial garage was eventually renovated into a community center for the neighborhood, a place where people could gather and learn skills that would help them build a better future together. I felt a sense of peace as I watched the grand opening, knowing that the place where I had hit my lowest point was now a source of hope for so many others. My name is still Arthur Miller, but I am no longer the man who defined himself by the size of his mansion or the balance in his corporate bank accounts at the end. I am the man who survived the ultimate betrayal and came out stronger on the other side, thanks to a woman who saw the truth before I was even willing to look. Business at the company began to thrive under a new model of shared ownership, where every employee had a stake in the success of the projects they spent their lives building for us. I started taking long walks through the city, looking at the skyline and feeling a connection to the buildings that I had never felt when I was just chasing the next big contract. One afternoon, I saw a young father teaching his son how to use a tape measure, and I stopped to give them a few tips on how to get an accurate reading every time. It reminded me of the early days with Leo, before the money and the influence had clouded his vision and turned him into a stranger I no longer recognized as my own blood. I wondered if there was still a spark of that little boy inside him somewhere, buried deep beneath the layers of resentment and entitlement that had driven us so far apart from each other. Henderson called me with an update on the civil suit, telling me that we had successfully recovered over 90% of the stolen funds from the offshore accounts Leo had tried to hide. I told him to put all of it into a scholarship fund for the children of our employees, ensuring that the next generation would have the opportunities that my own son had squandered. The mansion finally sold to a young family who promised to fill the rooms with laughter and light, and I walked away from the closing meeting without a single regret in my heart. I moved some of the gold into a safe deposit box for emergencies, but I kept one single coin on my nightstand as a reminder of Martha's incredible foresight and her enduring love. My health began to improve as the stress of the betrayal faded, and the doctors at the hospital were amazed at how quickly my lungs were finally clearing after that terrible winter bout. I started mentoring a young woman named Sarah, an architect who had brilliant ideas for sustainable housing but lacked the funding and the industry connections to get her first major project started. We worked together on a plan for a low-income housing complex on the south side, using the same land where the old industrial garage had stood for so many lonely and neglected years. Sarah reminded me of Martha in a way. She had that same quiet determination and a sharp eye for detail that caught the things everyone else seemed to overlook during the process. We broke ground on the project in early spring, and as I watched the first excavator bite into the earth, I felt a deep sense of closure that I hadn't expected to find. I received a final letter from Leo's defense attorney, asking for a character reference to help reduce his sentencing, but I told them that I could only speak the absolute and honest truth. The truth was that Leo had been given every advantage and had chosen to use them to hurt the people who cared for him most, and justice required him to answer for that. I stood in the courtroom on the day of his sentencing, watching as he was led away in handcuffs, and for the first time, I didn't feel any urge to step in. He looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and regret, but I just gave him a small, sad nod and walked out into the sunshine. The air felt clean and the city was bustling with life. A reminder that the world keeps turning even when your own little corner of it has been completely torn down and rebuilt. I stood on the dusty construction site of the new South Side housing complex, watching the steel beams rise toward the sky like ribs of a giant, hopeful creature waiting to finally breathe. Sarah showed me the blueprints for the community garden, explaining how the green space would provide fresh vegetables and a peaceful place for the neighborhood seniors to sit and talk every single afternoon. I felt a sense of pride that was different from the old days, because this project wasn't about making a profit, but about providing a dignified place for people to call their home. The trade school I funded began its first semester with 40 students, many of them young men who reminded me of myself back when I only had a hammer and a big dream. I visited the school every Tuesday to give guest lectures on structural integrity and the importance of honesty in business, things that my son had clearly forgotten along his path to total ruin. Leo called me collect from the state penitentiary, his voice sounding thin and desperate as he begged for me to use my influence to get him transferred to a lower security facility. I told him that I no longer had any influence in that world, and that he would have to learn how to survive on his own merits just like everyone else in the system. It was the hardest conversation of my life, but I knew that if I stepped in now, I would be repeating the same mistakes that had led us to that cold driveway birthday. Vanessa had disappeared entirely after the embezzlement charges were filed, and rumors suggested she had fled to a small town in South America with whatever little cash she had managed to hide away. I didn't spend any energy looking for her, because she was just a symptom of the disease that had already been rotting my family from the inside out for many, many long years. My old company, Miller Construction, was now being run by a board of directors made up of the foremen and engineers who had helped me build it from the very first brick. They invited me to the annual company picnic, where I saw the families of the workers I had almost lost, and I realized that my legacy was safe in their very capable hands. I sat on a bench with Bill, sharing a couple of beers and talking about the old days when we used to work for $20 a day and a greasy cheese sandwich. "You did good, Arthur," he said, patting my shoulder with a hand that was just as scarred and calloused as mine. "Martha would be damn proud of how you handled this mess." I looked up at the stars and wondered if she was watching, and if she knew that her secret garage stash had saved more than just my bank account from total and absolute destruction. The low-income housing project was completed ahead of schedule, and we held a ribbon-cutting ceremony that was attended by the mayor and hundreds of people from the local community who needed help. I watched as a single mother moved her 3 children into their brand new apartment, her eyes filling with tears of joy as I handed her the keys to her very first safe home. That moment was worth more than all the millions I had ever made, and I realized that true wealth is measured by the number of lives you have touched in a positive way. I decided to donate the old industrial garage property to the city permanently, so it could serve as a permanent vocational training center for generations of young builders to come after me. We named it the Martha Miller Center, and I placed a small plaque near the entrance with a quote about building strong foundations that can withstand even the most violent of life's storms. My health continued to hold steady, and I found myself enjoying the simple pleasures of a morning walk and a good book without the constant pressure of a multi-million-dollar corporate empire. I sold the rest of the gold coins and invested the proceeds into a green energy startup that was developing affordable solar panels for residential homes in the most underserved parts of the city. Every now and then, I would see a news report about the rise in white-collar crime, and I would think about Leo sitting in his cell, finally learning the true cost of his greed. I hoped that one day he would truly understand the gravity of his actions, not out of a desire for revenge, but because I still wanted my son to become a decent human being. I started a small garden on the balcony of my penthouse, growing tomatoes and peppers that tasted better than any expensive meal I had ever eaten in a fancy downtown Chicago steakhouse restaurant recently. Sarah came over for dinner once a week to update me on our new projects, and I started to see her as the daughter I never had but always wished for in my heart. She challenged my old-school ideas with her innovative designs, and together we created buildings that were not only strong and functional, but also beautiful and harmonious with the surrounding urban environment and nature. I felt like I was finally finishing the work that Martha and I had started so many years ago, but with a wisdom that only comes from losing everything and finding it all again. The city council honored me with a Lifetime Achievement Award for my contributions to the local skyline, but I accepted it on behalf of every worker who ever held a shovel for me. I didn't mention Leo or the betrayal during my speech, choosing instead to focus on the importance of community and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of great personal adversity. My life had become a series of quiet moments and meaningful connections, far removed from the loud parties and the hollow prestige that had once defined my existence in that lonely mansion. I visited the local library and started a reading group for seniors, where we shared stories of our lives and realized that we all had a few hidden secrets buried under our floors. It was a diverse group of people from all walks of life, and their friendship became a source of great comfort and strength for me during the long and cold Illinois winter months. One day, a package arrived from the prison containing a small wooden bird that Leo had carved in the woodshop class I had encouraged him to take while he was serving his time. It wasn't perfect, but it was a sign that something inside him was starting to change, a small crack in the armor of his arrogance that gave me a glimmer of hope. I placed the bird on my mantle next to Martha's photo, a symbol of the fragile possibility of redemption and the enduring power of a father's love, even after such a deep wound. I continued to live simply, finding that I didn't need much to be happy as long as I had a roof over my head and a sense of purpose in my daily life. The apartments Martha bought were always full, and I made sure the rent stayed affordable for the working families who were the lifeblood of the city I had grown to love so much. I often thought back to that birthday morning on the driveway, and I realized that it was the greatest gift I could have ever received, though it felt like a curse then. It stripped away the lies and the distractions, leaving me with only the truth of who I was and what really mattered in the short time we are given on this beautiful earth. I was no longer the useless old man my son had described, but a pillar of the community and a protector of the legacy that Martha had so carefully and lovingly guarded for me. As I turned 65, I spent my birthday at the Martha Miller Center, watching the students graduate and receive their certifications in carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work with such pride in their eyes. There were no lavish parties or expensive gifts, just the sincere gratitude of people who had been given a second chance at a better life because of a secret hidden in a garage. I realized that Martha hadn't just saved my money. She had saved my soul by forcing me to face the reality of my son's character and my own role in his many failings. I felt a deep sense of peace as I sat in the front row, listening to the speeches and knowing that the foundation I had built was finally strong enough to last forever. The sun set over the city, casting a warm golden glow over the buildings I had constructed, and I felt a connection to every brick and every beam that I had touched. I was a builder, not just of structures, but of lives and communities, and that was a title that no one could ever take away from me, not even my own blood. I walked home through the quiet streets, my heart light and my mind clear, ready to face whatever challenges the next chapter of my life might bring with grace and with great dignity. I knew that the road ahead would still have its share of obstacles, but I was no longer afraid of the dark or the cold because I carried the light of Martha's love. I stopped at a small park and watched the children playing, their laughter a reminder that the cycle of life continues and that there is always hope for a brighter and better tomorrow. My son would one day be released, and when that day came, I would be ready to meet him as a man who had finally earned his own way in the world at last. We might never have the relationship we once had, but we could perhaps find a new way to be father and son, built on a foundation of truth and mutual respect and honesty. Until then, I would keep building, keep helping, and keep living a life that would make Martha proud of the man I had become in her absence after all these very long years. I reached my apartment building and waved to the doorman, a man named Carlos who had become a good friend and a trusted confidant over the past few months of my residency. I went upstairs and made myself a simple dinner, looking out over the city lights and feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place. I realized that the garage secret wasn't just about the gold or the cash, but about the resilience of the human heart and the capacity for love to reach across the great divide. I took out my journal and wrote down a few thoughts about the importance of family and the dangers of greed, hoping that one day my words might help someone else avoid mistakes. The story of Arthur Miller was no longer a tragedy of betrayal, but a triumphant epic of restoration and the enduring power of a wife's silent protection from beyond the cold, dark grave. I felt a cool breeze coming through the window, and I smiled, knowing that the foundation was solid and the roof was tight, just the way a good builder always intends it. I closed my eyes and whispered a thank you to the wind, feeling Martha's presence in the quiet room as I drifted off into a deep and peaceful sleep without any more fear. The next morning, I woke up early and started my day with a sense of purpose, ready to continue the work that had become the true calling of my long and varied life. I was no longer defined by the things I had lost, but by the things I was giving back to the world that had given me so much over the past 6 decades. I walked to the job site and put on my hard hat, feeling the weight of it on my head like a crown of honor that I had finally earned the right to wear. The workers greeted me with smiles and handshakes, and I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be, surrounded by the people who shared my passion for building something great. We spent the day working on the foundation of the new library, making sure that every measurement was perfect and every pour was smooth and even across the entire expanse of the site. I felt a sense of satisfaction that only a builder can understand, the feeling of creating something that will stand long after you are gone and your name has been forgotten by many. As the day ended, I stood back and looked at the work we had done, and I knew that it was good, a solid beginning for a place of learning and of great growth. I walked back to my apartment, the sun setting behind me and the city lights beginning to twinkle like 1,000 tiny stars in the vast and darkening sky above the Chicago lakefront. I felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that I had lived my life with integrity and that I had left the world a little bit better than I had found it initially. The betrayal by my son was now just a distant memory, a painful chapter in a much larger story that had a beautiful and redemptive ending that I never could have imagined. I was a man who had found his way home, not to a mansion on a hill, but to a place of peace and purpose in the heart of the city I loved. I looked at the gold coin on my nightstand one last time before turning out the light, a silent witness to the journey and the woman who had made it all possible. I knew that whatever the future held, I would be ready to face it with the same strength and determination that had brought me through the darkest days of my life so far. I was Arthur Miller, a builder of homes, a restorer of lives, and a man who finally understood the true meaning of a family legacy that is built on love and not money. I am 65 years old today, and for the first time in my entire life, I am exactly where I need to be, standing tall on a foundation that will never, ever crack.